everyone, and welcome back. My name's Diana. This is my channel Bookish Di, and today I'm wrapping up my January in reading. So overall, January was a wildly successful reading month for me. I read 14 books. It could have easily been 15, but I ended up DNFing a book about 75-ish of the way through, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But overall, 14 books, I read a new favorite. I read a book that's been on my TBR shelf for a really long time. I finished a series. I did start a series though, so anyway, but overall, really successful month. I, for the most part, enjoyed most of what I read, so let's get into it. So before I start going into the main body of what I read this month, there are 3 books that I won't be talking about in this video because they are HarperCollins titles. And the HarperCollins Union has asked that we don't review any HarperCollins titles until they have a contract. So I am doing vlog style reviews for this, and I'll release them once the strike is over and they have a fair contract. So the 3 books that I won't be talking about today are Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lynn Tan, The Girl from Everywhere by Heidi Helig, and then my DNF of the month, The Ship Beyond Time, also by Heidi Helig. So who knows when that video is going up, but it will go up sometime after the 1st of February because they still don't have a contract. So the first book I read in January was Even Though I Knew the End by C.L. Polk. This is a supernatural noir series set in Prohibition era Chicago. And it centers on a woman, Helen Brandt, who is a supernatural detective. She's been exiled from this order for selling her soul for 10 years, and her time is almost up. And so she's hoping to get one final weekend with the love of her life, Edith, but a client gives her an offer she can't refuse, the debt on her soul. And so she does this job. Her debt will be repaid. She doesn't have to be dragged to hell. And so she ends up discovering through investigating a conspiracy that ties into her remaining family, her brother, as well as drawing in people that she knows throughout Chicago. So I really enjoyed this. I have read one other book by C.L. Polk. I read their Witchmark, which is the first book in their Kingston cycle, and I've been meaning to read more of them for a really long time. And so I decided that I had this novella. It was on the shorter side. I had been hearing good things and decided to give it a go. So what I really liked about this book is I really enjoyed the characters. I thought Helen was a really fascinating point of view character. While she knows a lot about the world that she inhabits, there are things that she's still discovering as we find out in this book. I also really loved her relationship with Edith. And just how Polk captured kind of the tenderness and the longing. And for this time period, there could have been a lot of queer tragedy, but there wasn't, which again, I appreciate. And then I also thought the world building itself was really interesting. I don't want to compare it to Supernatural because Supernatural is its own weird thing. But there are elements in here that I think fans of Supernatural might like, particularly involving angels and demons and kind of organizations around that. What are you up to, buddy? Anyway, so I really liked this. I thought that it was a really good length. I would love to see more in this universe. I thought the novella left off on a good point where we could potentially see more of Helen and Edith, but so far as a standalone, I also think it works really well. I gave it 4.25 out of 5 stars, and I would definitely recommend you pick it up. Next, I listened to an audiobook. I listened to The Blue Castle by Ella Montgomery, narrated by Kelly Traeger. This is one of Ella Montgomery's very few adult books, and it centers on this woman, Valency Sterling, who at 29 has very much had a life not lived. She's with her mother and her aunt. She's very worn down by them. A lot of kind of her creativity and personality is just stifled living with them and interacting with her family. And at the start of the book, she gets news that she has this health condition that only leaves her about a year left to live. And so she just kind of decides to say fuck it and start living her life and doing things for her rather than doing things or not doing things out of fear of what her mother or the rest of her family will say. And she ends up entering into a marriage of convenience with a man, Barney Snaith. And and so the reason it's called the Blue Castle is one way that Valancy tries to escape from the monotony of her life is she imagines this place called the Blue Castle where, you know, she can have romances with these imaginary men, where she can, you know, be the person that she always imagined herself to be. And when she moves in with Barney Snaith, she falls in love also with the cabin that he's living in and calls it her own Blue Castle. So this was absolutely delightful. I loved this. So I'm mostly familiar with Ellen Montgomery through her Anne books, as well as Jane of Lantern Hill, which is one of my personal favorites. I love Jane of Lantern Hill. But so I hadn't read this one before, and I was in the mood for an audiobook that was short, that had some kind of comforting familiarity to it. And I'm so glad I picked this up. Valancy is just this delightful female character. She has like some shades of Anne Elliot, but whereas Anne Elliot was very self-sacrificing, very much had, you know, turned down this possibility for happiness before, Valancy never had that possibility. And so a lot of the book is her seizing the chance to be happy and seizing the chance to have her own life. I also really love the relationship she forms once she starts saying, you know, fuck it. So you have her reconnecting with someone from school that she ends up taking care of. You have her relationship with that woman's father, with Barney Snaith. Another component of this book is one of the few ways when Valancy is living with her family that she gets any kind of pleasure, any kind of outlet for her imagination are these books by John Foster, which are naturalist books, so talking about nature and everything. So yeah, this was such a delightful book. I'm so glad I read it. I finally read it. I do need to get my own physical copy at some point. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Like, just something about it really worked for me. And I would really recommend it, especially if you like Persuasion. Like, it's not the exact same vibes as Persuasion, but the romance was so good. I really liked Valancy. I really liked Barney. Yeah, this was so delightful. I was so glad that I finally picked this up. Following that, I read a book that has been on my bookshelves for a really long time. I'm not gonna say years, but I think this is one of the oldest books on my TBR, and that is Velveteen versus the Junior Super Patriots by Shauna Maguire. So this collects a number of short stories that Shauna Maguire had written back in live journal days and posted on her LJ, following a young woman, Velma Martinez, who used to be a superhero known as Velveteen, but when she turned 18, she left the Junior Super Patriots and started living off on her own. And so when we meet Velveteen, she's trying to drive from California to Oregon to do a job interview so that she can, you know, finally start earning money, finally make a life for herself instead of struggling to make ends meet. And so throughout this book, we get some flashbacks into her time with the Junior Super Patriots. We get information about what the Junior Super Patriots or their parent organization are, and just kind of how superheroes work in this world. So this is very early Shauna Maguire, and reading this, I could see the seeds of things that come up in her other work. So I would say the one this actually reminded me the most of is Middle Game, because Middle Game goes into kind of similar themes of like examining the world and the shadowy organization trying to control someone it views as their property. The writing style is very shonen. I would say if you don't really get on with her writing style, don't read this, because it is like distilled how she writes. And I can't really describe how it like put it into words, but I always know when I'm reading a Shauna Maguire work, and this is very much a Shauna Maguire work. I thought the world building was interesting. I liked Velma as a character. She's someone who has had to deal with a lot of shit and is just trying to sort it out. I would say oh God. Anyway, this was just, it was interesting. This book is very much out of print. I know there are 2 other books in this world, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to ever find them, because it's very out of print. But anyway, this is really interesting. I'm glad I read it. I ended up giving like 3.5 stars. Like, it's not my favorite Sean McGuire. I did enjoy it. I thought there were times that the world built, like the prose got a little much, and because it's so short, like it's less than 200 pages and they're all just interconnected short stories, there were some things that I felt that could have been fleshed out a little more. I don't know if she's ever going to revisit these or ever rework these, but I am glad I finally read it, and I don't know, maybe I'll try and track down the next 2 volumes. After that, I read Blackmail and Bibinka by Mia P. Manansala. This is the 3rd book in the Tita Rosie Kitchen mystery series. And in this book, it is set around Christmas time, and we are following our main character, Lila, and her family. Her never-do-well cousin, Ronnie, has returned, and he and his business partners are opening a winery in Shady Palms, and one of his investors gets murdered, and so Lila and her friends and family have to try and figure out what's going on and why is someone trying to blackmail them about Ronnie's past in Florida. So I enjoyed this. This I think is probably my favorite cozy mystery series that I'm keeping up with. Not that I'm keeping up with a lot right now. I really like Lila as a character. I think she's really interesting, really fun. She's very human. She's someone who is trying to learn from her mistakes. So in the climax of the book, she specifically references stuff that has happened in the climaxes of past books and, you know, trying to learn from them and not repeat those mistakes. I also really love the cast of characters. So we have her business partners, we have her family, we have her love interest, Jay, who's a dentist. And we're getting to see more of the town as well. I also just really like the diversity that we're getting. So Lila and her family are Filipino, her business partners are Pakistani and Mexican. You have different people throughout the town, and I really appreciate that as well. And then another thing I really appreciate with this book in particular is, Lila does not have a good relationship with the local law enforcement, and the only person that she did have a good relationship with ends up leaving the force. And so I think this is something that the author did deliberately. She has, I think, ma'am, Leia's rubbing up against the tripod. One thing that she had mentioned, I think in the afterword of Homicide in Hollow Hollow, which was the 2nd book, is kind of re-examining the cozy mystery. Ma'am! Anyway, kind of re-examining cozy mystery's relationship with law enforcement and trying to do something different. So I'm glad that she did. I think my main complaint is the pacing. This is a relatively short book and a lot happens with it, and similar to my feelings about the previous 2 installments, that there's not a lot of room to breathe after the climax. Like, it happens very quickly and then there's a very quick denouement. So I think that's just kind of my consistent complaint about the series, but overall I really enjoy it. I really love the writing, I really love the characters. I'm always super hungry after I read these books because there's just so much good food description as well. So I'd really recommend it if you're looking for something different in the cozy mystery space. And something that just has really good characters, and really good kind of small town world building. Then I read Sea Sparrow by Kristen Kishore. This is the latest book in her Graceling Realm series, and this takes place pretty much immediately after the events of Winterkeep, and we are following Hava, who is Queen Bitterblue's half-sister, and she is trying to decipher the Zilphium explosive notes that were part of the climax to Winterkeep. and she and the rest of the Monsian crew are returning home, and they end up shipwrecked and have to make their way back towards civilization and try to survive. So this is not my favorite of the Graceling Realms books, but I did really love it. I ended up reading it, most of it in like one sitting. Like I had read some of it and then I ended up doing like one more page. I ended up finishing it around like 12:30 at night. So yeah, I did enjoy this. I really liked Hava's perspective. So she's someone who we've seen before in previous books, but we've never gotten her point of view. And this book is pretty much only her point of view, only her trying to sort out, you know, who is she? What does she want to do? One of the things we learn very early on is she's very enamored with the ship that they're on and learning about sailing and climbing the mast and, you know, being at sea. And it's something that brings her joy in a way that she hasn't had in a long time. You also have Hava kind of dealing with the trauma around her mother and her father, King Lek, and just what happened that left her an orphan, as well as her trying to figure out what her perspective is. You also get some more world building about the Dells and Montsea and some of the kingdoms around Montsea, which I appreciate it. It's not a huge focus in the way that the political has been in the past for Kishore, but I still appreciated it. There is a little bit of romance here, but it's not the whole point, or it's not like a major component. I know some folks didn't like the sailing part, but I did think it was interesting, although especially at the beginning, it felt a little info dumpy, and it was very much, it felt like author has found this really cool thing and it really wants to share everything that they've learned with you all at once. So that was one thing I didn't necessarily enjoy, but for the most part, I did like it. I gave it a 4.25 out of 5 stars. I'm glad I read it. I definitely cried at various points. Christian Kishore is very good at making me cry during her books. I don't know if we're gonna get more in the Graceling Realm series. I definitely would love it if we did. I don't know what story we would get. But I would read it because I really like her writing, and I think the themes that she's exploring in these books, as well as the characters, are really well done, and they're some of my favorite YA that's being published today. After that, I read something very different. I read a true crime-ish nonfiction book called Blood in the Water, a true story of revenge in the Maritimes by Silver Donald Cameron. This book covers a case from 2013 in Cape Breton where 3 fishermen, seeing one of their neighbors, Philip Boudreau, poaching their lobster traps, ran him down and shot him, and the body was never recovered. And the author is going into the trial as well as the community where this happened. So I mostly picked this up because I had seen one of my friends on Goodreads add it and it sounded somewhat interesting. I don't see a lot of true crime based in the Maritimes, and you know, I was interested to see what was there, and I thought this book was really interesting. So while it does cover the trial and kind of goes into what may or may not have happened that day on the boat, there's conflicting stories about what happened between the 3 men accused of the crime. It's also really it mostly discusses the community where it happened. So it goes into the history of the Acadian communities in Cape Breton, which is where this happened. All 3 men were Acadian. This happened in an Acadian town. It goes into the history of Cape Breton itself. So it talks about how the original Mi'kmaq people lived there. It talks about colonization by both the Acadians and then the English. And it goes into the history of exploitation in that area, from like fishing and coal mining. And it also talks about what does justice mean, and goes into different conceptions of justice. So what does justice look like for like the legal system in Canada? So like the English justice system, what did justice look like for the Acadian colonists? both back when Nova Scotia was Acadia versus now, and how they conceptualize and how they may or may not use the local justice system and maybe come up with their own justice. And it also talks about conceptions of justice from the Mi'kmaq perspective and Indigenous conceptions of justice. And then it also talks about the failures of different systems that led to this point. And one of the arguments that Cameron makes is that this crime was inevitable, that something would have happened, that Philip Boudreau had been causing problems for so long, and there had never been a good mechanism to either hold him accountable or kind of remove him from the situation and maybe have him start over somewhere else where he didn't have this history, where he might not have been enabled by his family. But because of those factors, it was inevitable that something would happen with him. And so I thought that the book, when it was talking about like the history, was really interesting. The courtroom stuff, I wasn't super interested because it was very much like a day-by-day accounting of what happened. And it wasn't, for me, that wasn't the interesting part. But a lot of it was Cameron, who actually lived in the community. So he's not just parachuting in and talking about it. He was someone who had lived in Cape Breton for like 30 some odd years. He passed away before this book was published. And so he's bringing that more local perspective, which I appreciated. There were times when he goes into things that I didn't think were necessarily relevant to the story. Like there's an aside talking about the abuses of the Catholic Church, which I didn't understand where that fit. But this book was published. He had finished a draft and shortly after passed away. So we are not necessarily seeing maybe the product that we would have seen had he lived through the entire publication process. So I'm keeping that in mind. But I thought it was really interesting. I thought that especially the discussions of justice were the best part of the book. So I gave it a 3.5. I would say if you're looking for something a little bit different with your true crime, pick it up. Or if you're interested at all in the Maritimes, yeah, it was a very interesting book. Not my normal read, but I am glad I picked it up. Then in like 24 hours, a little over 24 hours, I did a reread of one of my favorite series. I reread Tamara Pierce's Protector of the Small series. It was mostly because my brain was being really squirrely and I was just having some issues concentrating on things. So I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna reread something. I've been wanting to reread some Tamara Pierce for a while. I'm just gonna reread my favorite series. I thought I was just gonna read like a book a day or something. No, I ended up reading First Test in a few hours, finished up Page, then went with Squire and Lady Night, and I'm really glad I did. I love this series so much. So this follows a young woman, Kelladry of Mindolin, from when she's 10 years old to when she's 18, and follows her through becoming the first open female page to becoming the first Lady Knight in Tortall in centuries. And I love Kel so much. She's just so determined to do the right thing, and she's powered by stubbornness but also compassion, and she has animal friends, and I love her relationships with her Night Master Raoul. He's just a fantastic mentor. She has the best parents in a Tamara Pierce book. Like her mom and her dad are very much present throughout the story. I love her friendship with Neil, and just like, I like pretty much everything I read from Tamara Pierce, but these are the books of my heart, and I'm glad I reread them because they make me so happy. I love pretty much everything about these books. And also, side note, I deeply appreciate that Tamara Pierce in like the early 2000s, because this book was published, I want to say in 2002? Yeah, it was 2002. Modeled one of her creepiest worst villains after Woody Allen. I respect that. Anyway, I love these books so much. I'm so glad I reread them. Next, I also reread Magic Bites by Ilona Andrews. This is the first book in the Kate Daniels series. Muddy Ness from My Name is Muddy Ness is hosting a reread in her Discord. And so I had read this book like 6 years ago, and I decided, you know what, I never finished this. I think grad school ate my time. I've heard amazing things about this series. I'm going to join and read and see what's going on, and I'm glad I did. So this book follows mercenary Kate Daniels, who, after the death of her mentor, goes to investigate and see what's happening, and during that time she meets the Beast Lord, so the head of all the shifters in Atlanta, as well, and we also meet the people who are necromancers, and we start learning about the mystery of Kate Daniels and her background. So I thought the world building was really interesting. So this is a world where magic has come back and has been back for decades, and there are times when magic is present where nothing electronic works versus when tech is active, and so magic doesn't really work, and so learning how to live with that. I think Kate is a really fun character. She's very much my type of female lead, where it's like asshole with a heart of gold, or like good is not nice. Like, she cares a lot, but she masks it under her like traditional mercenary exterior. I'm not a super big fan of the romantic lead right now because he is an asshole. He is like the limit of what I will accept as an alpha hole. And he like crosses that line a little bit. So yeah, Curran is on thin fucking ice. However, I really like Kate. I think the world building is fantastic. I have book 2 checked out from the library right now, so that's going to be something I'm going to be reading in February, and I'm glad I gave these books a second chance. And I've heard such good things about these books, as well as Ilona Andrews in general. And I am looking for like a new urban fantasy book series to read while I am desperately waiting for October Day, book 17. So I think these are going to fit that bill. And then the last book that I read in January, which I finished the final day of the month, is The World We Make by N.K. Jemisin. This is the finisher in her Great Cities duology. It picks up 3 months after The City We Became, where the avatars of New York and its boroughs are settling. However, the woman in white is starting a new assault, not only on them, but other cities in the world, and they're trying to figure out how do we fight back in the midst of a Trump-esque mayoral candidate's race, as well as other things that are happening. So this book worked much better for me than The City We Became, and I think it's because we've gotten a lot of that initial world building out of the way. We have the characters established, we have the magic system established. I thought that there wasn't as much like New York exceptionalism in this one, which I appreciated. We learn more about the other cities, so we get different interludes in this book with different cities. So we meet Tokyo, we meet London, we meet Paris, we meet Istanbul, and just kind of seeing how those cities are and what's going on with those cities, I thought was very interesting. I also appreciated getting to see some more of the characters that we didn't spend as much time with in the first book, particularly Padmini. I would say she's one of the co-leads in this book. And we also got some more information on what's going on with different cities in the United States. However, I think whereas book 1, I mentioned that there were the pacing made sense for the first book in a trilogy, not a duology. In this book, we're also dealing with some places where you can kind of see the seams where plot lines were shortened, or where plot lines were cut out. In particular, I would say Vanessa, who is one of the avatars, her plotline suffers. She's someone who I think, had this been a full trilogy, she might have been developed more, but as it is right now, she's very much like, we don't get much with her, which I think is a shame. And there's also the plotline about Manny and his family and what's going on with them that I think, had this been a trilogy, might have been expanded on more. So this is a book where I think we easily could have had it be a bit longer. Like, it's 357 pages. It's not super long. So I think potentially there could have been more in here, but I know Jemison did struggle writing this book, and she's talked about, you know, the reasons why this got moved from a trilogy to a duology. So I gave this about 4-star. I did enjoy it. I am definitely interested to see what she does next. I think she owes Orbit a book still, so I'm looking forward to the next thing that she writes. This isn't my favorite, but you know, it's a Jemison, so I still enjoyed it. So that's it for me. Those are most of the books that I read in January. Pretty decent month, both in terms of quality and quantity. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep up this pace through the rest of the year, but I think this is a good start. It sets me up with a nice buffer, and I did finish a series, which makes me happy. I will be doing a video about series at some point in the future. So did you have a good reading month in January? Did you have a good start to the year? Are there any books that I read that sound particularly interesting? Please let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy what you see, please like and subscribe. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll talk with you later. Bye.